What if I told you that a U.S. senator bought his seat for $140,000 in documented bribes, faced censure, then stayed in office? That a cabinet secretary went to prison for leasing federal oil reserves to friends in exchange for cash and cattle? That a mayor was caught on FBI surveillance smoking crack, served 6 months, then won re-election? These aren't conspiracy theories buried in fringe websites. They're recorded in congressional testimony, preserved in federal archives, detailed in impeachment proceedings. The machinery of American power has always run on agreements made in private, promises broken in public, and scandals quietly forgiven. If you're ready to walk through what actually happened behind the marble and the speeches, hit subscribe. Get comfortable, pour something warm, dim the lights, and settle in. We're opening the archives tonight. The deal that bought Montana started quietly enough. By March 1905, William Clark had already spent $140,000 purchasing his Senate seat through carefully documented bribes to Montana state legislators. The Senate investigation records show payments traced through bank ledgers, testimony from legislators who'd accepted cash, and Clark's own financial records subpoenaed by the committee. He faced censure. The vote was scheduled. Then Clark's allies negotiated a procedural delay, and during that delay, several key senators received timely campaign contributions from mining interests. The censure vote failed. Clark kept his seat for 6 full years, mining copper and writing legislation that protected mining interests. In the official record, it was a matter of insufficient evidence. In the actual ledgers, it was a lesson in how much democracy cost at wholesale prices. What follows spans different machinery. Albert Fall became Secretary of the Interior in 1921, a position that controlled oil leases on federal land. By April 1922, Fall had signed secret leases for the Teapot Dome oil reserves in Wyoming to Harry Sinclair's company. Interior Department files later revealed that Sinclair had loaned Fall $100,000 in cash and a herd of cattle for his New Mexico ranch. The Teapot Dome hearings in 1923 exposed the arrangement through bank records and testimony from Fall's ranch employees who'd witnessed the cattle delivery. Fall became the first cabinet member in American history to go to prison for crimes committed while in office. He served 9 months. The leases, meanwhile, remained legally complicated enough that Sinclair's company profited for years during the litigation. Now we shift forward 6 decades. In 1987, Charles Keating ran Lincoln Savings and Loan in Arizona. When federal regulators began investigating risky investments that would eventually cost taxpayers $3.4 billion, Keating contacted 5 U.S. senators, to whom he'd contributed $1.3 million in campaign funds. The Senate Ethics Committee probe documented meetings where these senators pressured regulators to back off. The arrangement was perfectly legal. Campaign contributions, followed by access, followed by intervention. One senator, Alan Cranston, received a formal reprimand. The others faced no consequences. Keating went to prison for fraud. The senators kept their seats. It's the kind of distinction that makes you wonder where the line actually was. The next case involves poker chips and justice. By 2005, Congressman Bob Ney of Ohio had developed a side business helping lobbyist Jack Abramoff. FBI wiretap evidence revealed Ney accepting luxury golf trips, meals, and concert tickets in exchange for inserting specific language into legislation. The quid pro quo was detailed in emails, receipts, and recorded phone calls. Ney pled guilty to conspiracy charges in 2006, served 17 months in federal prison, and lost his law license. The legislation he'd modified stayed on the books. His congressional pension stayed intact. It was accountability technically, just with very particular limits about what got taken away. Money changing hands in the final hours. On January 20, 2001, Bill Clinton's last day in office, he issued a pardon to Mark Rich, a financier who'd fled to Switzerland to avoid prosecution for tax evasion and illegal oil trading with Iran during the hostage crisis. Justice Department memos released later showed prosecutors had been building a case for 17 years. Rich's ex-wife had donated $450,000 to Clinton's presidential library fund and over $1 million to Democratic campaigns. The pardon came through at 1:30 a.m. Congressional hearings followed. No laws had been broken. Presidential pardons are nearly unlimited. It was just spectacularly convenient timing. Rich stayed in Switzerland. The oil trade stayed profitable. The pardon stayed permanent. Corruption packaged as gifts. In 1989, federal judge Alcee Hastings of Florida faced impeachment for accepting a $150,000 bribe to reduce sentences for mob-connected defendants. Impeachment trial documents showed the money trail through intermediaries and detailed testimony from the middleman who delivered the cash. Hastings was removed from the federal bench by Senate vote. 3 years later, he ran for Congress from a Miami district and won. He served in the House since 1993. The bribe that ended his judgeship became a footnote in a long political career. It's possible to lose one position in government and simply move to another, provided voters are forgiving. And the district is safe. Then there's the tape that should have ended everything. In January 1990, Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry was caught on FBI surveillance footage smoking crack cocaine in a hotel room during a sting operation. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. He served 6 months in federal prison. In 1994, he ran for mayor again and won, carrying the same wards that had supported him before. Voters knew what the tape showed. They elected him anyway. Barry served another 4-year term, pushed through budget reforms, and retired with his pension intact. The footage stayed in evidence. The contradictions stayed unexplained. It's the kind of outcome that makes you wonder what consequence means in practice. A bridge closed for revenge. In September 2013, lanes on the George Washington Bridge between New Jersey and New York were suddenly restricted, causing massive traffic jams in Fort Lee. Legislative inquiry transcripts revealed the closures were orchestrated by aides to Governor Chris Christie as political retaliation against Fort Lee's mayor, who hadn't endorsed Christie's re-election. Emails showed phrases like "time for some traffic problems in Fort Lee." 2 aides were convicted. Christie was never charged, though investigations established the order came from his inner circle. His political career stalled, not from prosecution but from the optics. The bridge reopened. The emails stayed public. The governor finished his term and moved on. Sometimes the punishment is just the story staying alive. A courthouse that cost more than the Civil War starts our next arc. By 1871, William Boss Tweed controlled New York City through Tammany Hall, and the city was building a new courthouse. The New York Times Expos revealed that the building, budgeted at $3 million, had cost over $13 million in documented expenditures. Invoices showed $7,500 for thermometers, $41,000 for brooms. The total theft, when auditors finished tracing contracts, approached $200 million in inflated bills and kickbacks. Tweed was convicted in 1873 and served time, but most of the money was never recovered. The courthouse still stands in Lower Manhattan, a marble monument to arithmetic that didn't add up, but somehow balanced perfectly in the right ledgers. Customs officers who kept the profits. In 1877, Chester Arthur ran the New York Customs House, where inspectors collected import duties on goods entering the country. A Hayes administration investigation revealed that customs collectors were legally entitled to keep a portion of the duties they collected as personal income, effectively a commission on enforcement. Arthur himself earned over $50,000 annually from this arrangement, far more than the president's salary. The system created obvious incentives to maximize seizures and inflate valuations. Arthur was removed from his position in 1878, but no charges were filed because the practice was technically legal. 3 years later, he became vice president. In 1881, he became president when Garfield was assassinated. The customs system was reformed. Slowly. But Arthur's earnings were never questioned. Ghost veterans cashing government checks. By 1892, the Pension Bureau in Washington was paying benefits to hundreds of thousands of Civil War veterans. A Gao audit revealed that thousands of recipients were either dead or had never served. Pension Commissioner James Tanner, himself a disabled veteran, had loosened verification standards to speed up payments, making it easy for fraudulent claims to slip through. Congressional investigators estimated that millions in federal funds were going to fake veterans or their fictitious widows. Tanner resigned under pressure, but the pension rolls remained bloated. The system was so backlogged that cleaning up the fraud would have taken years and required investigators to question legitimate disabled veterans. Most of the fake pensions stayed active until recipients died again, officially this time. Steel profits blessed by emergency. In 1917, as America prepared to enter World War I, Charles Schwab's Bethlehem Steel received massive no-bid government contracts to build warships. Congressional testimony later revealed that Bethlehem Steel's profit margins on these contracts exceeded 30%, far higher than competitive bidding would have allowed. Schwab argued that the emergency nature of the war made competitive bidding impractical. Congress agreed. The contracts stood. Bethlehem Steel became one of the largest corporations in America on the strength of wartime production, and Schwab became one of the wealthiest men in the country. The ships were built. The war was won. The accounting was never fully audited. It's the kind of arrangement where everyone got what they wanted, except the taxpayers who funded it. Highways that funded segregation. In 1956, Louisiana political boss Leander Perez controlled the Plaquemines Parish government and its share of new federal highway funds. FBI financial records revealed Perez was diverting highway construction money into a private slush fund used to finance segregationist legal challenges and pay for white citizens' council operations. The highway money came from federal matching funds, technically legal to receive, entirely illegal to redirect. Perez was never prosecuted because Louisiana officials declined to investigate, and federal authorities lacked clear jurisdiction over state highway administration. The highways got built eventually, though budgets ran over. The segregationist campaign stayed funded. Perez remained in power until his death in 1969, still considered a respected political figure in parts of Louisiana. Pentagon contracts as a closed loop. By 1988, the Department of Defense was buying weapon systems through a cozy network of contractors who shared inside information on bids. Operation Illwind FBI indictments revealed that Melvin Paisley, a senior Pentagon official, had been receiving cash payments and lavish gifts from defense contractors in exchange for steering contracts their way. The investigation ultimately led to 45 convictions among contractors and Pentagon officials. Hundreds of millions in contracts were found to have been awarded based on bribes rather than competitive merit. Paisley served 4 years in prison. The defense contractors paid fines and kept their contracts. The Pentagon reformed its bidding process with new oversight rules. Within a decade, new scandals suggested the oversight hadn't closed all the doors. $12 billion that walked away. In 2005, Paul Bremer was the U.S. administrator in Iraq, overseeing reconstruction efforts funded by Iraqi oil revenue and U.S. taxpayer money. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction issued a report documenting that $12 billion in cash, physically flown into Baghdad on military cargo planes, had disappeared into the chaos of post-invasion Iraq. Much of it was distributed in shrink-wrapped pallets of $100 bills with minimal documentation. Bremer's administration kept handwritten ledgers and informal receipts. When auditors tried to trace the money, they found gaps in nearly every accounting category. Bremer left Iraq in 2004. No one was ever charged with theft, though the report described the financial controls as non-existent. The money was simply gone, absorbed into a war zone where no one was tracking it carefully enough to notice exact destinations. Credit cards for debris removal buying luxury goods. In 2006, FEMA issued special purchase cards to contractors hired to manage Hurricane Katrina relief efforts in New Orleans. A Gao investigation found that FEMA cards were used for flat-screen TVs, designer clothing, and New Orleans Saints season tickets, purchases far outside the scope of debris removal and temporary housing. Receipts documented thousands of dollars in improper purchases across dozens of contractors. Some of the spending was fraudulent, much of it was simply careless, made possible by weak oversight during the emergency response. Several contractors faced prosecution, most repaid misspent funds through settlements. FEMA implemented new controls. The Saints tickets apparently had already been used. It's the kind of scandal where the punchline is real, and the tragedy is that people were still homeless while the games were being watched. Land deals inked in California gold. By 1864, the Pacific Railway Act was being amended to transfer enormous tracts of federal land to railroad companies building the transcontinental line. Collis Huntington, one of the Big Four railroad barons, lobbied Congress to expand land grants from 10 miles on each side of the track to 20 miles. The amendments passed, transferring over 20 million acres of public land to private railroad companies. Huntington's lobbying expenses, later documented in his business papers, included cash payments to key congressmen and lavish dinners where votes were discussed openly. The land became the foundation of the railroad monopolies that dominated Western commerce for decades. No one was prosecuted. The land grants were legal, the lobbying was standard practice, and the fortunes built on public resources stayed private. California grew into an economic powerhouse on tracts laid across land the public had given away. Oil leases signed after midnight. In April 1921, Interior Secretary Edwin Denby quietly approved the transfer of Navy oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private drilling by Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company. Interior Department files, later obtained during the Teapot Dome investigation, revealed Denby had signed the lease without competitive bidding and without notifying Congress, which had jurisdiction over Navy reserves. The deal was structured late at night and kept off official schedules. Sinclair's payment to Interior Secretary Albert Fall, Denby's colleague, became the focus of prosecution, but Denby himself was never charged. He resigned in 1924 under pressure and returned to private life. Sinclair's company kept drilling until courts invalidated the lease years later. Denby died quietly in 1929, remembered in Michigan as a war hero who'd made an unfortunate administrative error, sugar quotas that built a dictatorship. In 1934, Sumner Welles, U.S. Undersecretary of State, negotiated sugar import quotas with Cuba that ensured favorable prices for Cuban sugar producers. State Department cables, declassified decades later, revealed that Welles had coordinated with Fulgencio Batista, a military officer staging a coup, to ensure the sugar quotas would benefit Batista's allies. In exchange, Batista agreed to protect American business interests in Cuba. The deal secured Batista's rise to power and locked in American economic dominance. Welles was never investigated. His actions were considered diplomacy, not corruption. Batista ruled Cuba on and off until Castro's revolution in 1959. The sugar money flowed north for 25 years. Welles retired in 1943 and died in 1961, regarded as one of the architects of U.S. Latin American policy. It's one of those arrangements where everyone understood the terms, but nobody wrote them down. Concrete poured with mob approval. By 1950, New York City Mayor William O'Dwyer was overseeing massive public works projects, including housing developments and bridges. The Kefauver Committee hearings on organized crime revealed that O'Dwyer's administration had steered city concrete contracts to companies with documented mob connections. Testimony from contractors and investigators detailed meetings where mob figures approved bids before the city did. O'Dwyer denied knowledge but resigned in August 1950, accepting an appointment as ambassador to Mexico, a lateral move that looked like a promotion but effectively removed him from scrutiny. He served in Mexico until 1952, then retired to private life. The concrete contracts remained in place. The buildings still stand. The mob's cut was never fully traced. Milk money for the White House. In March 1971, Richard Nixon met with dairy industry lobbyists who'd contributed $2 million to his re-election campaign. Oval Office tapes, released during Watergate investigations, captured Nixon and aides discussing how to increase federal milk price supports in exchange for continued contributions. Days after the meeting, the Agriculture Department raised price supports, adding hundreds of millions to dairy profits. The connection was clear in the tapes, money, meeting, policy change. But campaign contributions were legal, and price supports were a routine agricultural policy tool. No one was charged. The dairy lobby got its price increase. Nixon's campaign got its funds. It's the kind of transaction where everything was documented, and nothing was prosecutable, because the pieces were arranged just carefully enough. Savings and loans given breathing room. In 1989, Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings and Loan in Arizona was insolvent, but federal regulators issued forbearance memos allowing it to continue operating. The memos, later released during congressional investigations, showed that regulators had delayed intervention after receiving pressure from senators who'd been bankrolled by Keating. The delay cost taxpayers an additional $2 billion as Lincoln continued making bad loans. Keating himself went to prison for fraud. The regulators who granted forbearance were transferred or retired quietly. Lincoln Savings collapsed in 1989, becoming the poster child for the S&L crisis that ultimately cost taxpayers over $120 billion. The regulatory memos stayed filed away. Evidence of decisions made in good faith, or at least with plausible deniability. Rolling blackouts by design. In 2000, California experienced massive electricity shortages and rolling blackouts that crippled the economy. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission recorded calls later revealed that Enron traders, led by CEO Kenneth Lay, were deliberately withholding power from the market to drive up prices. Transcripts included phrases like "just cut power to customers" and laughter about stealing money from California. The manipulation was documented, intentional, and enormously profitable. Enron collapsed in 2001 under accounting fraud investigations. Lay died before sentencing. California ratepayers had paid billions in inflated energy costs. The traders faced fines and some prosecutions, but most of the profits had already been moved through shell companies. The blackouts stopped. The recordings stayed public, a perfect record of a scam conducted in plain speech. A pardon that erased contempt. In August 2017, Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio was convicted of criminal contempt for defying a federal judge's order to stop racial profiling. The conviction carried a potential 6-month jail sentence. Presidential pardon documents show that Donald Trump issued a pardon in Arpaio's favor, erasing the conviction entirely. The pardon was legal, unambiguous, and immediate. Arpaio faced no jail time, no fine, no professional consequences. He ran for Senate in 2018 and lost, but he remained a public figure with speaking fees and media appearances. The families affected by his profiling policies received no restitution. The federal court's contempt ruling stood in the record as a fact, but without a conviction attached to it. It's accountability that stops at the courtroom door, but doesn't follow anyone home. Documents don't always tell the full story. Sometimes they tell too much. By the spring of 1875, the whiskey ring was operating across multiple states, but St. Louis was the epicenter. John McDonald, a supervisor of internal revenue, had organized a scheme where distillers paid him to underreport their production, thereby avoiding federal taxes on whiskey. Treasury Department raid records documented the operation in meticulous detail, coded telegrams, falsified production logs, and cash payments traced through multiple banks. When federal agents finally moved in, they seized records showing $3 million in tax fraud over 2 years. McDonald was convicted and sentenced to prison. President Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was implicated but acquitted after Grant testified as a character witness. The whiskey kept flowing. The taxes, when they resumed, were just folded into the cost of doing business. The senator's profitable water. In 1907, Nevada Senator Francis Newlands controlled vast tracts of land dependent on irrigation from the Truckee River. A Senate investigation revealed that Newlands had used his position on the Irrigation Committee to direct federal water projects toward his own properties, effectively increasing their value by millions. The investigation documented land purchases made just before federal irrigation announcements, water rights manipulated through committee amendments, and Newlands' business partners who profited from the timing. No laws had been broken, senators were allowed to own land, and water policy was complex enough that self-interest and public interest could be argued to align. Newlands served until his death in 1917. His estate, enriched by federal water, stayed in the family. The irrigation projects stayed operational. It's the kind of setup where everyone benefits, except the public that funded the infrastructure. Bootlegger paying both sides. By 1928, George Remus was one of America's most successful bootleggers, operating out of Cincinnati and Chicago during Prohibition. His court testimony, delivered after his arrest, revealed that he'd been paying federal agents to ignore his warehouses, while simultaneously paying local police to provide protection. The amounts were documented: $20,000 monthly to a federal agent, smaller sums to police captains, legal fees to judges who delayed prosecutions. Remus went to prison in 1925, was released in 1927, murdered his wife in 1927, and was acquitted by reason of temporary insanity. He served his bootlegging sentence, but walked free from the murder charge. The agents he'd paid were quietly transferred. The system he'd exposed continued operating with new names. Prohibition lasted until 1933, and every year in between, someone was collecting Remus's old protection fees under a different arrangement. Contracts for friends at the TVA. In 1938, the Tennessee Valley Authority was the New Deal's showcase project, bringing electricity and flood control to the rural South. Arthur Morgan, chairman of the TVA board, became concerned that construction contracts were being steered to politically connected firms. His congressional inquiry testimony detailed bid rigging, no-bid contracts to companies owned by board members' relatives, and cost overruns that dwarfed initial estimates. Morgan went public with his allegations. President Roosevelt fired him for insubordination. A congressional investigation found irregularities, but no criminal conduct. The contracts continued. The TVA became one of America's largest public power providers. Morgan returned to academia and wrote books about planning and corruption. The dams he'd opposed got built. The water still generates electricity. It's one of those cases where the whistleblower was right, but the project worked anyway, which somehow made the corruption easier to forgive. A vicuna coat for a government favor. In 1958, Sherman Adams, White House Chief of Staff under Eisenhower, accepted a vicuna coat and an oriental rug from Boston industrialist Bernard Goldfein. House subcommittee documents revealed that Adams had made phone calls to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Trade Commission on Goldfein's behalf, while investigations into his companies were ongoing. The gifts were documented through receipts and testimony. The calls were logged in White House records. Adams claimed he'd done nothing improper. He'd merely inquired about the status of cases, not intervened in outcomes. That distinction didn't hold. Adams resigned in September 1958 under pressure. Goldfein was later convicted of tax evasion. The coat became a symbol of Eisenhower-era scandal, modest by later standards, but devastating at the time. Adams died in 1986. The coat reportedly ended up in a museum somewhere. A $700 gift that cost a career. Contractor kickbacks that bought a vice presidency. By 1973, Spiro Agnew had been vice president for nearly 5 years, but prosecutors in Baltimore were investigating his time as Baltimore County executive and Maryland governor. The plea bargain transcript shows that Agnew had accepted over $100,000 in cash payments from engineering firms that received county and state contracts. The payments continued even after he became vice president, delivered in envelopes to his office. The evidence was overwhelming: contractor testimony, financial records, witnesses who delivered the cash. Agnew negotiated a deal, resigned the vice presidency, plead no contest to a single tax evasion charge, and avoid prison. He resigned on October 10, 1973. He paid a $10,000 fine and received 3 years probation. He kept his government pension. He practiced law quietly, then became a consultant. In 1980, a Maryland court ordered him to repay $268,000 in kickbacks. He paid. He died in 1996. It was the first vice presidential resignation in American history, but it wasn't treated like a historic crime. It was treated like an embarrassing deal that needed to be closed quickly and quietly. The fake sheikh who caught Congress. In 1980, the FBI ran an operation called Abscam, using an undercover agent posing as a representative of a wealthy Arab sheikh seeking to invest in America. The operation targeted public corruption. FBI videotape evidence, later shown in court, captured 6 congressmen and 1 senator accepting bribes in exchange for promises of legislative favors, immigration assistance, and business permits. The tapes were damning: cash changing hands, explicit discussions of influence, congressmen stuffing money into pockets. All 7 were convicted. The evidence was clean, the operation legal, and the sentences ranged from probation to 3 years in prison. The scandal briefly energized calls for ethics reform. Entrapment defenses failed. The footage aired on national news. But the system itself barely changed. Abscam caught individuals, not the culture that made them think the deal was safe. The tapes are still used in law enforcement training, a how to guide and what not to get caught doing. HUD money lost in influence trades. By 1989, the Department of Housing and Urban Development under Secretary Samuel Pierce had become a patronage machine. An Inspector General report documented that $2 billion in HUD funds had been directed to politically connected developers, often with minimal oversight. Pierce had delegated decision-making to aides who traded HUD subsidies for consulting fees paid to influential Republicans. The system was indirect enough to avoid criminal charges. Developers hired consultants. Consultants lobbied HUD. HUD approved projects. Pierce was never charged. Several aides were convicted of fraud and perjury. The housing projects, some of them, got built. Many didn't. The $2 billion became a line item in federal waste reports. Pierce, nicknamed Silent Sam for his low profile, returned to private practice. He died in 2000, remembered more for his silence than his tenure. It's the kind of corruption that disappears into complexity, where every decision has a justification and the pattern only becomes visible from a distance. Double ledgers that bribed Congress. In the summer of 1872, the Credit Mobilier scandal broke into public view through newspaper investigations. Oakes Ames, a Massachusetts congressman, had been distributing stock in Credit Mobilier, the construction company building the Union Pacific Railroad, to fellow congressmen at prices far below market value. The Poland Committee findings documented the scheme in detail. Stock certificates issued to congressmen, dividends paid that exceeded the stock's purchase price within months, and testimony from Ames himself admitting he'd sought to create friends in Congress while the railroad received massive federal subsidies. The committee recommended expulsion for Ames and 1 other congressman, but the House voted only for censure. Both men kept their seats. Ames died 2 months later, reportedly from stress. The railroad got built with federal money. The dividends kept arriving for investors. It's one of those moments where the corruption was exposed, documented, and filed away as a regrettable chapter rather than a systemic failure. An Interior Secretary's oil holdings. In 1909, Richard Ballinger became Secretary of the Interior under President Taft. Within months, Ballinger was accused of favoring private mining and oil interests in Alaska. The Glavis Memo, written by Louis Glavis, a young investigator in the Interior Department, documented that Ballinger owned stock in companies that stood to benefit from Interior Department decisions on Alaskan coal lands. Glavis brought his concerns to Gifford Pinchot, the head of the Forest Service and a vocal conservationist. Pinchot took the allegations public. Taft fired Pinchot, not Ballinger. A congressional investigation followed, but Ballinger was cleared of criminal wrongdoing. The stock ownership wasn't illegal. Ballinger resigned in 1911, citing health reasons. Pinchot became a national figure in the conservation movement. The coal lands were developed by private companies. It's the kind of case where the whistle got blown, the whistleblower got fired, and the outcome depended on which side you thought represented progress. Harding's poker cabinet emptied the safe. By 1923, Warren Harding's presidency was collapsing under the weight of scandals involving his closest advisors. Attorney General Harry Daugherty, one of Harding's poker-playing friends from Ohio, was facing Senate hearings over allegations of selling pardons, liquor permits during Prohibition, and protection to bootleggers. Testimony from investigators revealed that Daugherty kept a private safe in his office that allegedly contained records of illicit payments. When subpoenaed, Daugherty claimed the safe had been emptied and its contents destroyed to protect the privacy of President Harding, who had died in August 1923. Senate investigators couldn't prove what had been in the safe. Daugherty was never convicted. 2 trials ended in hung juries. He resigned in 1924, practiced law in Ohio, and wrote a memoir defending Harding's legacy. The safe stayed empty. The poker games, fondly remembered by participants, became a symbol of the Harding administration's casual relationship with propriety. A Supreme Court seat saved by resignation. In 1969, Justice Abe Fortas was Lyndon Johnson's close advisor and a sitting Supreme Court justice. Life magazine published an investigation revealing that Fortas had accepted a $20,000 annual retainer from the family foundation of Lewis Wolfson, a financier under investigation for securities fraud. The payments had continued even after Fortas joined the court. Documents showed the retainer agreement, the checks, and the timing. Fortas had intervened with the Justice Department on Wolfson's behalf. Facing certain impeachment, Fortas resigned in May 1969, the first Supreme Court justice to resign under threat of removal. He returned to private law practice in Washington, arguing cases and advising clients, but never returned to public life. Wolfson went to prison for securities violations. The seat was filled by Harry Blackmun. The retainer agreement, small by modern lobbying standards, ended a Supreme Court career because it crossed a line that hadn't been clearly drawn until it was crossed. Tuna boats at military bases. In 1976, Florida Congressman Robert Sykes, a powerful member of the Armed Services Committee, was investigated for using his position to profit from a seafood company. The House Ethics Committee report documented that Sykes owned stock in Fairchild Industries, which held contracts with the military, and in a bank that financed fishing operations at naval bases. He'd used his committee position to steer contracts toward his investments. The amounts were modest, tens of thousands in stock value, but the conflict was clear. Sykes was reprimanded by the House in July 1976, one of the first members disciplined under new ethics rules. He lost his committee chairmanship, but stayed in Congress until 1979, when he chose not to run for re-election. He died in 1994, remembered in his Florida district as a champion of military spending who brought jobs and bases to the Panhandle. The tuna presumably kept getting caught and sold. The ethics rules stayed on the books, loosely enforced. Superfund sites and EPA favoritism. In 1983, Rita Lavelle ran the EPA's hazardous waste cleanup program, overseeing the new Superfund tasked with remediating toxic sites. Congressional hearings revealed that Lavelle had steered Superfund money towards sites and districts represented by Republican congressmen while delaying cleanups in Democratic districts. She'd also met secretly with executives from companies responsible for contamination, discussing settlements that favored polluters. When subpoenaed to testify, Lavelle provided misleading answers. She was cited for contempt of Congress and later convicted of perjury. She served 6 months in federal prison and paid a $10,000 fine. The Superfund program continued, though its budget and effectiveness fluctuated with each administration. Lavelle's career in public service ended. The toxic sites, many of them, stayed toxic for years longer than necessary, while political considerations dictated cleanup schedules, 5 senators, and regulatory pressure. In 1989, Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings and Loan was insolvent, but 5 U.S. senators intervened with federal regulators on Keating's behalf. The Senate Ethics Probe documented meetings where Senators Alan Cranston, Dennis DeConcini, John Glenn, John McCain, and Donald Regal pressured the Federal Home Loan Bank Board to ease up on Lincoln. Keating had contributed $1.3 million to their campaigns and causes. The senators' defense was that they were performing constituent services. The Ethics Committee's conclusion was more nuanced. Cranston had crossed ethical lines and received a reprimand. The others had shown poor judgment but committed no violations. Lincoln Savings collapsed in 1989, costing taxpayers $3.4 billion. Keating went to prison for fraud. 4 of the 5 senators eventually left office, though only Cranston's departure was directly tied to the scandal. McCain, who'd received the least money from Keating, went on to become a presidential candidate and vocal advocate for campaign finance reform. It's one of those ironies where the scandal defined the reform, and the reformer was one of the original accused. Gulf in Scotland, indictment in Texas. In 2005, House Majority Leader Tom DeLay traveled to Scotland for a golf fundraiser paid for by lobbyist Jack Abramoff. Lobbyist expense records, later obtained by investigators, showed that the trip cost over $70,000, paid through a charity that Abramoff controlled. The golf was played at St. Andrews. The fundraising was done in luxury hotels. The tab included private jets and high-end accommodations. The trip wasn't the crime. DeLay was later indicted in Texas for money laundering related to corporate donations to state legislative campaigns. But it symbolized the blurred line between lobbying, fundraising, and governance. DeLay resigned from Congress in 2006. His conviction was initially upheld, then overturned on appeal in 2013. He never served time. Abramoff went to prison for fraud. The golf course is still there, green and immaculate, hosting players who pay their own way. A senator who killed in a duel. On September 13, 1859, California Senator David Broderick faced pro-slavery politician David Terry in a duel near San Francisco. The duel death certificate, filed with local authorities, recorded that Broderick died from a gunshot wound to the chest 3 days after the duel. Terry, who'd been California's Chief Justice, claimed the duel was over personal honor. Political observers noted that Broderick was an anti-slavery Democrat challenging the southern wing of his party. Terry was never charged with murder. Dueling, though illegal, was rarely prosecuted when both participants were gentlemen. Terry returned to law practice. Broderick became a martyr for the anti-slavery cause in California. The duel was framed as a personal dispute, but the timing and politics suggested it was an execution disguised as honor. It's one of the more literal examples of political violence that the system chose not to see as political. A congressman's forgotten other wife. In 1937, Texas Congressman Maury Maverick, a progressive Democrat from San Antonio, was revealed to have a complicated marital history. Divorce records surfaced showing that Maverick's first marriage had ended in a way that raised questions about whether his second marriage was legally valid at the time it occurred. The revelation caused brief scandal. Accusations of bigamy appeared in opposition campaign materials. Maverick addressed it publicly, explaining the timeline and the legal technicalities. Texas voters, particularly in his working-class district, didn't seem to care. He was reelected in 1938. Maverick served 2 more terms, became a prominent voice for New Deal policies, and later served as mayor of San Antonio. He died in 1954, remembered as a maverick. The word, reportedly, entered common usage partly because of his family and his independent political streak. The divorce records stayed filed. His political career survived. It's a reminder that scandal requires an audience willing to be scandalized. A senator on Nazi payroll. In 1938, Ernest Lundin, a senator from Minnesota, accepted payments from a German agent named George Sylvester Viereck. FBI surveillance files, declassified decades later, documented that Viereck paid Lundin to insert pro-German speeches into the congressional record and mail them to constituents using Lundin's franking privilege. The payments were laundered through Viereck's front organizations. Lundin delivered over a dozen speeches that echoed Nazi propaganda, arguing against American intervention in Europe. The investigation was ongoing when Lundin died in a plane crash in August 1940. Viereck was later convicted of failing to register as a foreign agent. Lundin's involvement became public after his death, but since he was dead, no prosecution followed. His Senate seat was filled in a special election. The speeches stayed in the congressional record, part of the official archive. It's one of those cases where death prevented accountability, and history had to serve as the only judge. Prostitution ring in a congressman's apartment. In 1989, Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank admitted that Stephen Goby, a male prostitute, had been living in Frank's apartment and running a prostitution service from there. The House Ethics Inquiry investigated whether Frank had used his office to fix Goby's parking tickets and whether he knew about the prostitution operation. Frank testified that he'd hired Goby as a personal aide, had a personal relationship with him, and had indeed intervened on the parking tickets, but insisted he didn't know about the prostitution ring. The Ethics Committee issued a reprimand, a formal rebuke, but not expulsion. Frank was re-elected in 1990 and continued serving until 2013, becoming a powerful voice on financial regulation and one of Congress's first openly gay members. Goby was convicted of state charges related to the prostitution. Frank's career survived the scandal, in part because voters in his district separated his personal life from his legislative effectiveness. The apartment, one assumes, got new tenants. A mayor caught on video smoking crack. In November 2013, Toronto Mayor Rob Ford admitted to smoking crack cocaine after police obtained surveillance video showing him using the drug. The video had been recorded by associates involved in the drug trade, and its existence was reported by journalists months before Ford confirmed it. Ford initially denied the allegations, then admitted to smoking crack in a drunken stupor. He refused to resign. Toronto City Council stripped him of most of his powers, but he remained mayor. He ran for re-election in 2014, but withdrew due to a cancer diagnosis. His brother Doug ran in his place and lost. Rob Ford died in 2016. The video, eventually released by police, became a global news story. Ford's support remained strong in suburban Toronto wards throughout the scandal. It's one of those situations where the evidence was undeniable, the admission was public, and the consequence was mostly political theater that didn't end the way scandals usually do. A congressman's private zoo under investigation. In 2020, Jeff Lowe, not a congressman, but a figure connected to former Oklahoma congressional candidate Joe Exotic, whose real name was Joseph Maldonado Passage, faced USTA inspection records showing extensive violations at his exotic animal zoo. The connection to politics is indirect but documented. Exotic ran for Congress in 2016 and for governor of Oklahoma in 2018, both times as a libertarian, while operating a private zoo that became the subject of the Netflix documentary Tiger King. USTA records showed animal welfare violations, improper care, and illegal wildlife transactions. Exotic was convicted in 2019 on federal charges of wildlife violations and a murder-for-hire plot. He's currently serving a 21-year sentence. The political angle here is that someone with an active federal investigation into animal abuse and illegal activity was simultaneously running for office. It's absurd enough that it stays memorable. The zoo closed. The Tigers were relocated. The political campaigns were never serious threats, but they happened, and votes were cast. Aquarium renovations as office expenses. In 1995, Oregon Senator Bob Packwood, already facing sexual harassment allegations that would force his resignation, was also investigated for financial improprieties. Ethics Committee logs revealed that Packwood had charged personal expenses, including an expensive aquarium renovation for his Senate office, to his office account. The renovations cost thousands of dollars and included custom installations that looked more like a personal hobby than office infrastructure. Combined with the harassment allegations and evidence that he'd altered his personal diaries before submitting them to investigators, the aquarium became a symbol of entitlement. Packwood resigned in September 1995 before the Senate could vote to expel him. He kept his pension, returned to private lobbying work in Washington, and largely disappeared from public view. The aquarium, one imagines, was probably removed or inherited by his successor. It's one of those small details that gets remembered because it's so petty compared to the larger scandal. Governor's payments for silence. In 2007, Nevada Governor Jim Gibbons was accused by multiple women of inappropriate behavior. During his divorce proceedings, court testimony revealed that a Las Vegas casino executive had paid tens of thousands of dollars in gifts and cash to Gibbons and his wife. The payments, according to divorce court testimony, were characterized by Gibbons' wife as attempts to buy silence and favor. Gibbons denied the allegations, but acknowledged receiving gifts. He was investigated by the Nevada Ethics Commission and the FBI, but no charges were filed. His marriage ended in a bitter public divorce. He served out his term as governor, but lost the Republican primary in 2010. He left office in 2011 and largely withdrew from politics. The casino executive faced no charges. The payments were defended as friendship and legitimate business hospitality. The testimony stayed in divorce records, evidence of how money moved in ways that were legally defensible but ethically murky. You've heard scandals from 6 different centuries now. If something stuck with you, drop a comment. We're curious what lands hardest at midnight. When the silence finally broke in 1972, it started in a parking garage. Bob Woodward of the Washington Post met an FBI source known as Deep Throat, later revealed to be Mark Felt, in an underground garage, where Felt provided guidance on following the money trail from the Watergate burglary to the Nixon White House. The Washington Post articles, based on Felt's information and the reporter's investigation, traced payments to the burglars through a Mexican bank account connected to Nixon's re-election committee. The investigation slowly unraveled the cover-up, hush money, destroyed documents, and obstruction of justice reaching into the Oval Office. Nixon resigned in August 1974, before the House could vote on impeachment. Felt's identity stayed secret until 2005, when he revealed himself. Nixon died in 1994, partially rehabilitated as a foreign policy elder statesman. The parking garage became iconic. Watergate became shorthand for any political scandal. The suffix gate has been appended to hundreds of controversies since. The silence breaking didn't just expose one crime, it changed how journalism approached presidential power. Shredding documents in the White House basement. In November 1986, news broke that the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran and used the proceeds to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, violating congressional prohibitions. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, working from the National Security Council, directed the operation. When investigators closed in, North and his secretary spent a weekend shredding documents in the old executive office building. The Tower Commission report documented the shredding, the operation's structure, and the layers of deniability built into the scheme. North was indicted, tried, and convicted. But his conviction was overturned on appeal because he'd been granted immunity for his congressional testimony. President Reagan claimed he didn't know about the diversion of funds, though he'd authorized the arms sales. The immunity deal meant North's testimony couldn't be used against him, which made prosecution impossible. North became a conservative media figure. The Contras got their funding. Iran got its weapons. The documents stayed shredded. It's one of those cases where everything was exposed, and the exposure didn't lead to accountability. It led to a complicated legal dance that ended with everyone walking away. Missing files found in the White House residence. In 1996, Hillary Clinton's billing records from her time at the Rose Law Firm in Arkansas, documents that had been subpoenaed by the Senate Banking Committee investigating the Whitewater real estate scandal, were found in the White House private quarters. The records had been missing for 2 years. Senate Banking Committee files documented that Clinton had done legal work for Madison Guaranty Savings and Loan, whose failure cost taxpayers millions, and whose owner was later convicted of fraud. The billing records, when they surfaced, showed more involvement than Clinton had previously described, though no illegal activity. Clinton testified that she didn't know how the records had ended up in the residence or why they'd been missing. No charges were filed. The Whitewater investigation continued for years, expanding into other areas, and eventually led to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. The billing records became evidence of nothing illegal, but something suspicious. The files are now stored in the National Archives. It's the kind of scandal where the mystery of the missing documents overshadowed what the documents actually contained. A blue dress. In FBI evidence. In 1998, Monica Lewinsky turned over a blue dress to Kenneth Starr's investigators during the probe into President Clinton's relationship with her. The dress became physical evidence that contradicted Clinton's earlier testimony, denying a sexual relationship with Lewinsky. DNA testing confirmed that the dress carried Clinton's DNA. The Starr report, delivered to Congress, included explicit details based on the dress and Lewinsky's testimony. The House impeached Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. The Senate acquitted him in February 1999. Clinton's approval ratings, oddly, remained high. Voters distinguished between personal behavior and job performance. Clinton finished his term, left office in January 2001, and remained a prominent political figure. Lewinsky became a public advocate against cyberbullying and spoke publicly about the scandal's impact on her life. The dress stayed in FBI evidence storage. It's one of those cases where the evidence was incontrovertible, the impeachment happened, and the political consequence was minimal. The dress became iconic for what it represented about proof, privacy, and the distance between legal guilt and political survival. A CIA officer's identity revealed. In July 2003, journalist Robert Novak published the identity of Valerie Plame, a covert CIA officer, in a newspaper column. The column came after Plame's husband, former Ambassador Joseph Wilson, wrote an op-ed criticizing the Bush administration's claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. The CIA leak investigation, led by Patrick Fitzgerald, determined that Louis Scooter Libby, Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, had leaked Plame's identity to journalists. Libby was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice, but acquitted on charges related to the leak itself. President Bush commuted Libby's prison sentence, and President Trump pardoned him in 2018. Plame's career at the CIA ended. Wilson became a vocal critic of the Iraq War. Cheney defended Libby throughout. The leak investigation established that senior officials had discussed Plame with journalists, but the who leaked first question was never definitively resolved. It's one of those scandals where the cover-up was prosecuted, but the underlying offense, revealing a covert officer's identity, was treated as collateral damage in a political fight. Instant messages to congressional pages. In September 2006, ABC News disclosed that Florida Congressman Mark Foley had sent sexually explicit instant messages to teenage male congressional pages. The messages, obtained by journalists, were graphic and inappropriate. Foley resigned from Congress immediately, before any formal investigation began. The scandal expanded when it emerged that House Republican leadership had been aware of Foley's inappropriate contact with pages for months, but hadn't acted. No criminal charges were filed, the pages were over 16, the age of consent in D.C., and the messages, while inappropriate, didn't constitute illegal solicitation under federal law. The scandal contributed to Republicans losing control of the House in the 2006 midterm elections. Foley entered treatment for alcoholism and largely disappeared from public life. The pages' identities were protected. The instant message logs were published in redacted form. It's a scandal where resignation was immediate, consequences were political rather than legal, and the institutional failure, leadership's inaction, got more attention than the individual's behavior. A laptop shared with investigators. In June 2011, Congressman Anthony Weiner admitted that he'd sent sexually suggestive photos to women via social media, something he'd initially denied. The FBI's discovery came later. In 2016, when agents investigating an unrelated case found emails on Weiner's laptop that were relevant to the investigation into Hillary Clinton's private email server. The discovery came weeks before the 2016 presidential election. FBI Director James Comey notified Congress that new emails had been found, a decision that became intensely controversial. The emails turned out to be duplicates of ones already reviewed. Weiner's mayoral campaign had collapsed in 2013 after another sexting scandal. In 2017, he was sentenced to 21 months in prison for sexting with a minor. He served his sentence and was released in 2019. His political career, once promising, had been destroyed not by a single scandal, but by a pattern of behavior that kept reasserting itself. The laptop stayed in evidence. The emails became a footnote in the 2016 election controversy. Weiner's story became a cautionary tale about self-destruction, played out in public over years. A witness who didn't survive to testify. In February 1924, Jake Heyman, an Oklahoma oilman and key witness in the Teapot Dome investigation, was found shot to death in his home. Heyman had been preparing to testify about payments made to Interior Secretary Albert Fall. The death was ruled self-inflicted, though investigators noted inconsistencies in the scene. Hamon's testimony would have connected additional oil executives to the bribery scheme. Without his testimony, several leads went cold. The official investigation into his death concluded quickly. Fall was eventually convicted based on other evidence, but Hamon's death meant some participants were never fully implicated. The mysterious shooting became a footnote in Teapot Dome histories, usually mentioned as an unresolved element. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder whether witnesses died conveniently or coincidentally, and whether the distinction mattered to the investigation's outcome. Hoffa's books opened under oath. In 1957, Teamsters President Jimmy Hoffa faced the McClellan Committee, a Senate investigation into labor racketeering. The committee's grilling, broadcast on national television, revealed that Hoffa had used Teamsters pension funds for personal loans, had ties to organized crime figures, and had overseen a union where financial records were deliberately chaotic. Chief Counsel Robert Kennedy pressed Hoffa relentlessly. Hoffa's responses ranged from evasive to defiant. The pension fund looting was documented through subpoenaed bank records showing millions in loans to Las Vegas casinos and trucking companies that never repaid the money. Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and fraud in 1964, served nearly 5 years in federal prison, and was released in 1971 when Nixon commuted his sentence on the condition that Hoffa stay out of union politics. In 1975, Hoffa disappeared, presumably murdered by organized crime figures. His body was never found. The pension fund abuses led to federal oversight of union finances, but by then, billions had been moved through the system. Hoffa's testimony made for dramatic television. The accounting, such as it was, stayed messy for decades. A photo exposed as fake. In 1954, Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade reached the U.S. Army. During the Army-McCarthy hearings, McCarthy presented a photograph that he claimed showed a secret meeting between an Army official and alleged communists. Army counsel Joseph Welch examined the photo and revealed that it had been doctored. The image was actually a cropped and altered version of a routine public event. The exposure came during live testimony, broadcast to millions of Americans. Welch then delivered his famous rebuke. "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" At long last, have you left no sense of decency? The hearing room applauded. McCarthy's credibility collapsed. The Senate censured him in December 1954. He died in 1957 from health issues worsened by alcoholism. The doctored photo became a symbol of McCarthy's willingness to fabricate evidence. The hearings marked the end of his political power. The photo itself, both versions, ended up in the National Archives as evidence of how easily documentation could be manipulated before the digital age. An 18-minute gap that couldn't be explained. During the Watergate hearings in 1974, investigators discovered that a key White House tape recorded 3 days after the Watergate break-in contained an 18.5-minute gap. Rosemary Woods, Nixon's personal secretary, testified that she might have accidentally erased part of the tape while transcribing it, demonstrating an awkward stretch across her desk to reach the record button while answering the phone. Technical experts testified that the gap was caused by at least 5 separate manual erasures, not one accident. The content of the erased conversation was never recovered. Nixon's lawyers argued that it was an accident. Investigators concluded it was deliberate destruction of evidence. The gap became a symbol of the cover-up, proof that something on that tape was damaging enough to erase. Nixon resigned before the full extent of the cover-up could be documented. Woods died in 2005, never changing her story. The tape, with its conspicuous silence, remains in the National Archives. It's one of those moments where the absence of evidence became more damaging than the evidence itself might have been. North's lawyer and immunity protection. In July 1987, Oliver North testified before Congress about Iran-Contra with immunity from prosecution. His lawyer, Brendan Sullivan, famously declared, "I am not a potted plant," when committee members tried to limit his objections. North's testimony was televised, dramatic, and carefully managed. He admitted to shredding documents, lying to Congress, and running covert operations, but framed himself as a patriot following orders. The immunity meant his testimony couldn't be used against him in criminal court. North was convicted in 1989 on 3 felony counts, but the convictions were overturned on appeal in 1990 because prosecutors couldn't prove they hadn't used immunized testimony. North became a conservative media personality, ran unsuccessfully for Senate in Virginia, and later became president of the INRA. Sullivan became one of Washington's most prominent defense attorneys. The immunity deal meant the most detailed confession in the scandal became legally useless for prosecution. The testimony is archived and studied, a masterclass in how to admit everything and face no consequences. Starr's report published in explicit detail. In September 1998, independent counsel Kenneth Starr delivered a 453-page report to Congress detailing President Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky. The Judiciary Committee voted to release the full report to the public, including sexually explicit descriptions of encounters in the Oval Office. The report was published online, becoming one of the first major government documents to be widely distributed via the internet. Millions of Americans read descriptions that were clinical, graphic, and intended to establish that Clinton had lied under oath about the nature of the relationship. The explicitness of the report became its own controversy. Critics argued it was gratuitous, while defenders said it was necessary to prove perjury. The House impeached Clinton based on the report. The Senate acquitted him. Starr returned to private practice and later became president of Baylor University, a position he resigned from in 2016 amid a sexual assault scandal involving the university's handling of student complaints. The report stayed online, archived permanently. It's one of those documents where the level of detail undermined its stated purpose, turning a legal case into something closer to public humiliation. Memory problems under oath. In 2007, Scooter Libby stood trial for perjury and obstruction of justice in the Valerie Plame leak case. Special Prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald argued that Libby had lied about when and how he learned Plame's identity and what he told journalists. Libby's defense was that his memory had been faulty, he'd been handling multiple national security issues, and couldn't be expected to remember every conversation precisely. The jury didn't buy it. Testimony from journalists showed Libby had discussed Plame before he claimed to have learned about her. Notes from meetings contradicted his statements. Libby was convicted on 4 of 5 counts. His sentence was 30 months in prison and a $250,000 fine. President Bush commuted the sentence, sparing Libby from prison but leaving the conviction in place. President Trump pardoned him fully in 2018. Libby's law license was suspended, then reinstated after the pardon. The selective amnesia defense failed in court but succeeded in the court of political opinion. The conviction stayed on the books for 11 years, proof that memory can be an excuse, but not always a successful one. Saturday night and a principled refusal. On October 20, 1973, President Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor investigating Watergate. Richardson refused and resigned instead. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork carried out the order, firing Cox and triggering what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The 3 men's decisions, 2 refusals and 1 compliance, revealed the moment when rule of law and presidential power collided. Richardson and Ruckelshaus became symbols of integrity. Bork's legal career continued, and Reagan later nominated him to the Supreme Court, but the Senate rejected him, partly due to lingering resentment over the firing. Cox was replaced by Leon Jaworski, who continued the investigation. Nixon resigned 9 months later. Richardson returned to government service in later administrations. The Saturday Night Massacre became a template for what happens when institutions hold and when they bend. The firings happened. The investigation continued. The principle outlasted the power. A vice president's tax deal. On October 10, 1973, Spiro Agnew resigned the vice presidency and entered a Baltimore courtroom to plead no contest to 1 count of tax evasion. The plea bargain transcript shows that prosecutors had evidence of decades of bribery, cash payments from contractors delivered to Agnew's office while he was Baltimore County Executive, Governor of Maryland, and Vice President. The evidence was overwhelming enough that Agnew's lawyers negotiated his resignation in exchange for no prison time. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation and fined $10,000. He was disbarred. He kept his pension. The resignation was the first by a sitting vice president in American history. Gerald Ford replaced him, a choice that positioned Ford to become president when Nixon resigned 10 months later. Agnew spent his remaining years consulting and writing a novel. He died in 1996. The plea deal stayed sealed for years. When it was finally released, the extent of the corruption was staggering. Agnew had been taking bribes for 20 years, right up until his resignation. The deal avoided a trial, but ensured the facts stayed buried long enough for the story to become history rather than scandal. A helicopter exit from the South Lawn. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency and left the White House by helicopter, waving from the steps before departure. His resignation letter, submitted to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, was 1 sentence: "I hereby resign the office of President of the United States." He became the only president in American history to resign. The resignation came as the House Judiciary Committee prepared articles of impeachment based on the Watergate tapes, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. Nixon faced certain impeachment and likely conviction. The helicopter departure was televised live. Nixon flew to California, where he lived until his death in 1994. Gerald Ford, who'd been appointed vice president after Agnew resigned, became president and issued a pardon to Nixon 1 month later, ending any possibility of federal prosecution. The pardon was controversial, but final. Nixon spent his post-presidency rehabilitating his image as a foreign policy expert. The helicopter shot became iconic. The resignation letter stayed brief and formal, revealing nothing. A speaker's book deal as income fraud. In May 1989, Speaker of the House Jim Wright resigned under pressure from an ethics committee investigation into his finances. The committee had found that Wright had evaded House limits on outside income by having a publisher pay him unusually high royalties on a book that was sold in bulk to groups with interests before Congress. The arrangement let Wright earn speaking fees disguised as book revenue. Ethics committee pressure intensified as Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, pushed for Wright's removal. Wright delivered an emotional resignation speech, warning that mindless cannibalism was consuming Congress. He left the House in June 1989. The book stayed in print. Wright returned to Texas, taught at Texas Christian University, and stayed active in Democratic politics until his death in 2015. The book deal became a case study in creative accounting, legal on paper, ethically dubious in practice, and politically fatal when exposed. Ethics violations and a $300,000 fine. In January 1997, the House voted 395-28 to reprimand Speaker Newt Gingrich and fine him $300,000 for ethics violations related to using tax-exempt organizations for political purposes and providing false information to the Ethics Committee. The House reprimand document detailed how Gingrich had taught a college course funded by tax-exempt donations while using the course to develop political strategy. He'd also given misleading testimony during the investigation. Gingrich paid the fine, some through personal funds, some through loans from Bob Dole. He remained Speaker until 1998 when Republicans lost seats in the midterm elections and Gingrich faced internal revolt. He resigned from Congress in November 1998. He later became a political commentator, Fox News contributor, and presidential candidate. The $300,000 fine was paid. The ethics reprimand stayed on his record. Gingrich's career demonstrated that ethics violations don't necessarily end political influence. They can become a footnote in a longer story. An airport bathroom and a wide stance. On August 27, 2007, Idaho Senator Larry Craig was arrested in a Minneapolis airport bathroom by an undercover police officer investigating complaints of lewd conduct. The police report described Craig's behavior, foot tapping and hand gestures under the stall divider, as signals for sexual contact. Craig pled guilty to disorderly conduct in a bid to make the arrest go away quietly. When the arrest became public weeks later, Craig held a press conference declaring "I am not gay" and claiming his guilty plea was a mistake made under pressure. He argued his foot movements were part of a wide stance while using the toilet. The explanation became a punchline. Senate Republicans pressured him to resign. Craig announced he would not seek re-election, but served out his term until 2009. He returned to Idaho and largely withdrew from public life. The police report stayed public. The wide stance defense stayed infamous. The arrest ended a 3-decade Senate career, not because the offense was particularly serious, but because the explanation was impossible to take seriously. Sexting a minor ends in prison. In May 2017, former Congressman Anthony Weiner was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison for sexting with a 15-year-old girl. This was Weiner's third public scandal involving sexually explicit online communications. The first, in 2011, ended his congressional career. The second, in 2013, destroyed his New York City mayoral campaign. The third resulted in federal criminal charges. Weiner pled guilty, acknowledging he'd sent explicit messages and images knowing the recipient was underage. He served his sentence in federal prison, was released in 2019, and registered as a sex offender. His wife, Huma Abedin, a close aide to Hillary Clinton, divorced him. The case had unexpected political consequences. The FBI's discovery of emails on Weiner's laptop during the investigation led to the October 2016 reopening of the Clinton email investigation, a moment many analysts believe influenced the presidential election. Weiner's destruction was complete. The prison term was finite, The damage to others' careers was collateral, but real. Grant's secretary acquitted and kept. In 1875, President Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was indicted for his role in the Whiskey Ring tax fraud scandal. Evidence included coded telegrams between Babcock and the conspirators, suggesting he'd warned them of impending raids. Grant, convinced of Babcock's innocence, provided a deposition serving as a character witness, an extraordinary intervention by a sitting president. The jury acquitted Babcock, persuaded more by Grant's endorsement than by the evidence. Babcock kept his White House position. Grant's reputation suffered. He was seen as either willfully blind or complicit. Babcock left the White House in 1876 when Grant chose not to run for a third term, but faced no legal consequences. He worked as a federal engineer and died in 1884 when a bridge collapsed during an inspection. The acquittal demonstrated presidential power to shield loyalists even when evidence suggests guilt. Grant's loyalty to Babcock became a stain on his presidency. The telegram stayed in evidence, but the verdict stayed acquittal. Dougherty's burnt records and hung juries. In 1927, former Attorney General Harry Dougherty faced trial for conspiracy to defraud the government related to his handling of German assets seized during World War I. The trial centered on $7 million that had disappeared from accounts Dougherty controlled. Dougherty's defense was that he'd destroyed records in his office, safe to protect the reputation of the late President Harding. Without the documents, prosecutors struggled to prove what had happened to the money. The first trial ended in a hung jury. So did the second. Prosecutors gave up. Dougherty was never convicted. He returned to Ohio, practiced law, and wrote a memoir defending Harding and himself. He died in 1941. The burned records meant the full story was never established. Dougherty's strategy, destroy the evidence, claim noble motives, wait out the prosecutors, worked perfectly. It's one of those cases where the absence of evidence became a kind of evidence, but legally it meant nothing. Reagan's plausible ignorance accepted. In 1987, the Tower Commission investigated President Reagan's knowledge of the Iran-Contra affair, arms sales to Iran, and illegal funding of Nicaraguan rebels. The commission's report concluded that Reagan had created an environment where such activities could occur, but hadn't directly ordered the illegal diversion of funds. Reagan testified that he couldn't recall key decisions. The "I don't remember" defense, repeated throughout his testimony, was accepted partly because Reagan was 76 and beginning to show signs of what would later be diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. The Tower Commission report was critical but didn't establish presidential culpability. Reagan remained popular. His approval ratings recovered. He left office in 1989, celebrated for ending the Cold War. Oliver North and others took the fall. Reagan's distance from operational details, real or constructed, protected him. The structure of the operation allowed for plausible deniability, which the investigation respected. Reagan died in 2004. His Iran-Contra testimony a footnote to his presidency. Christmas Eve pardons that ended investigations. On December 24, 1992, President George H.W. Bush pardoned 6 former officials involved in Iran-Contra, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, who was scheduled to go to trial in weeks. The pardons were issued weeks before Bush left office, having lost re-election to Bill Clinton. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh, who'd spent years building cases, issued a statement saying the pardons demonstrated that powerful people with powerful allies can commit serious crimes in high office without consequence. Bush defended the pardons, saying the officials had been prosecuted for policy differences, not crimes. The pardons were final and unreviewable. Weinberger never stood trial. The other 5 avoided further prosecution. Walsh's investigation effectively ended. Bush left office in January 1993. The pardons ensured that senior officials involved in Iran-Contra faced no accountability. The Christmas Eve timing made the pardons feel like a last-minute cover-up. The investigation's findings stayed public, but the trials never happened. Cheney's role in the leak never charged. In 2006, prosecutors in the Valerie Plame leak case documented that Vice President Dick Cheney had discussed Plame's CIA identity with Scooter Libby, his chief of staff, and that Libby had leaked it to journalists. Cheney was never charged. Libby took the fall, was convicted of perjury and obstruction, and had his sentence commuted by President Bush. Cheney remained in his undisclosed location, a term that became a running joke during the Bush administration, referencing security measures that kept Cheney's whereabouts secret. Cheney served out his term, left office in 2009, and remained active in Republican politics. The investigation traced the leak back to Cheney's office, but never established that Cheney himself had committed a prosecutable offense. Libby's conviction was later fully pardoned by President Trump. Cheney's memoirs, published in 2011, defended the administration's actions. The leak investigation established the facts, but prosecuted only the subordinate. It's how hierarchies protect themselves. The details go up, but the charges stop somewhere in the middle. Wall Street executives and no prosecutions. In 2009, after the financial crisis had wiped out trillions in wealth and required a $700 billion taxpayer bailout, federal prosecutors faced decisions about charging Wall Street executives. Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman Sachs, and other senior executives had overseen the sale of mortgage-backed securities their firms knew were likely to fail. Congressional hearings exposed emails where executives called their own products junk and crap while selling them to clients. Despite evidence of deception, the Justice Department brought no criminal charges against major bank executives. Civil settlements extracted billions in fines from corporations, but individuals faced no jail time. The decision was defended as pragmatic. Financial fraud cases are complex, and convictions weren't certain. Critics argued it established that senior executives were too important to prosecute. Blankfein retired in 2018 with a reported net worth over $1 billion. The banks paid fines from corporate accounts, meaning shareholders absorbed the cost. TARP funds were eventually repaid, but the lack of prosecutions left the impression that the crisis had no individual villains, just systemic failures. The emails stayed in evidence. The executives stayed free. Clinton's pardon hearing produced no consequences. In 2001, shortly after leaving office, Bill Clinton faced congressional hearings about his pardon of Mark Rich, a fugitive financier who'd fled to Switzerland to avoid prosecution for tax evasion and illegal oil trading with Iran. The hearing established that Rich's ex-wife had donated $450,000 to Clinton's library fund and over $1 million to Democratic campaigns. Clinton testified that he'd consulted with legal advisors who believed Rich had been unfairly charged. The hearing was critical, but couldn't reverse the pardon. No laws prohibited the pardon, no matter how questionable the timing or the appearance of quid pro quo. Clinton faced no legal consequences. Rich stayed in Switzerland until his death in 2013. The pardon stayed in effect. The library fund kept the donation. The hearing produced outrage but no accountability, because presidential pardon power is nearly absolute. It's one of those constitutional provisions that work as designed even when the design allows for abuse. Papers burned to protect a president's memory. In 1964, Warren Harding's widow Florence died in Ohio, and shortly after, most of Harding's personal papers were destroyed by his family. Historians had long sought access to letters and diaries that might explain the scandals of his administration: Teapot Dome, the Justice Department corruption, the Harding Inner Circle's criminal activities. Florence Harding had burned many documents herself before her death, and executors destroyed more. What survived was carefully curated to protect Harding's reputation. Decades later, additional letters emerged showing Harding's extramarital affairs and his awareness of corruption in his cabinet. The burned papers stayed gone. The controlled release of selected documents shaped Harding's historical image for generations. It's one of those cases where destroying evidence is legal when it's private property, even when the public interest is clear. The archive that should have existed became an archive of silences. Nixon's tapes selectively released for decades. After Nixon resigned in 1974, the National Archives took custody of his White House tapes, thousands of hours of recordings from the Oval Office. The tapes were released gradually over decades, with the most sensitive material held back. Selective release meant that some tapes became public during the Ford administration, others during Reagan, and some as late as the 2000s. The full transcripts weren't available until 2013, nearly 40 years after Nixon's resignation. By the time the complete record was public, most of the participants were dead, and the political context had shifted. The early releases shaped Watergate prosecutions. The delayed releases shaped historical understanding. The gaps, including the famous 18.5-minute erasure, stayed unexplained. Nixon's estate fought release for years, arguing privacy concerns. The National Archives prevailed eventually. The tapes are now digitized and available, but the delay meant they couldn't fully inform public judgment when it mattered most. Reagan's diaries published with edits. In 2007, the Reagan Foundation published Ronald Reagan's presidential diaries, marketing them as a complete record of his thoughts during his 8 years in office. The diaries were edited for publication. Entries were cut for length, sensitivity, and clarity. Material related to Iran-Contra was softened or contextualized with footnotes that provided Reagan's later explanations. The published version presented Reagan as detached from the scandal's details, consistent with his testimony. Historians who later gained access to unedited versions found that some entries had been more ambiguous about Reagan's knowledge. The published diaries became the authoritative source for most readers, shaping Reagan's legacy as someone who'd been out of the loop rather than deliberately ignorant. The editing was legal and openly acknowledged, but the effect was to control the narrative. Reagan's reputation as the president who ended the Cold War overshadowed the scandal. The diaries stayed edited. The full record stayed restricted. Its history written by the estate, not by the archivists. Cheney's Energy Task Force records sealed. In 2001, Vice President Dick Cheney convened an energy policy task force that met with oil and gas executives to develop the administration's energy policy. Environmental groups sued for access to the meeting records, arguing that the task force was subject to open meeting laws. Cheney fought the lawsuit all the way to the Supreme Court. In 2005, the court ruled 7-2 in Cheney's favor, deciding that the task force records could remain secret. The decision upheld executive privilege in policy development. The records were never released. Energy policy developed by the task force favored fossil fuel industries, including provisions that benefited companies like Halliburton, which Cheney had led before becoming vice president. Critics argued the secrecy proved corruption. Defenders argued it protected deliberative process. The meetings happened. The policy was implemented. The records stayed sealed. It's the kind of legal victory that protects power by protecting process, ensuring that what was discussed stays known only to those who were in the room. Torture memos declassified selectively. In 2009, the Obama administration declassified portions of the Office of Legal Counsel memos that had authorized enhanced interrogation techniques, torture, by many legal definitions, during the Bush administration. The declassification was selective. Memos authorizing waterboarding and stress positions were released. Memos naming CIA officers who conducted interrogations and details of specific operations stayed classified. The architects of the legal justifications, John Yoo, Jay Bybee, and others, were named publicly but faced no criminal charges. Bybee, a federal judge, kept his lifetime appointment. Yoo returned to teaching at Berkeley Law. The ACLU and human rights groups argued that the redacted material hid evidence of war crimes. The administration argued that full disclosure would endanger intelligence sources. The memos showed how torture was legally justified, but not who exactly did it or where. The legal protections stayed intact. The policy changed under Obama, but no one was prosecuted. The architecture of accountability stopped at the documents and didn't extend to the architects. Clinton's presidential records delayed and disputed. In 2013, The National Archives faced a dispute with Bill Clinton's representatives over the release of presidential records. Under the Presidential Records Act, documents become public 12 years after a president leaves office, but Clinton's team sought to delay release of certain emails and memos related to pardons, particularly the Mark Rich pardon. The dispute centered on whether the communications were subject to executive privilege even after the presidency. Some records were released, others stayed withheld. Researchers found that key communications about Rich's pardon had been conducted through back channels that left minimal paper trail. The delay meant that the full accounting of controversial decisions came long after public attention had moved on. The emails that were released showed deliberation, but rarely smoking guns. Clinton's post-presidency remained lucrative and prominent. The records stayed partially sealed. By the time historians accessed most material, it was history, not scandal. Trump's perfect call transcript edited. In 2019, after a whistleblower reported that President Trump had pressured Ukraine's president to investigate Joe Biden, the White House released a transcript of the July 25 call. The transcript, however, was not a verbatim recording, but a reconstruction stored on a classified White House server. The released version showed Trump asking President Zelensky to do us a favor and investigate Biden. Key ellipses in the transcript indicated omitted material. Whistleblower testimony suggested the full call was more explicitly transactional. The edited transcript became the basis for Trump's first impeachment. Trump was acquitted by the Senate. The full, unedited recording, if one exists, has never been released. The White House described the call as perfect. The transcript showed otherwise, but the gaps left room for interpretation. Trump's defenders cited the transcript as evidence of innocence. His critics cited it as evidence of guilt. The server stayed classified. The reconstruction stayed official. It's one of those modern scandals where the evidence is simultaneously public and hidden, released but edited, a transparency that obscures as much as it reveals. A cabinet wife's gambling debts. In 1876, William Belknap, Secretary of War under President Grant, was impeached by the House for selling tradership posts at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Impeachment testimony revealed that Belknap's wife Amanda had accumulated significant debts and that Belknap had accepted $24,000 in payments from a trader seeking the lucrative Fort Sill appointment. The payments came regularly over 5 years. Amanda Belknap had negotiated the arrangement before she died, and Belknap continued accepting payments after remarrying. When the House moved to impeach, Belknap resigned hours before the vote, hoping to avoid trial. The Senate tried him anyway, but he was acquitted when enough senators voted that resignation had ended their jurisdiction. Belknap returned to private life in Washington, practiced law, and lived comfortably until his death in 1890. The $24,000 was never returned. The trading post stayed profitable. The dresses purchased with bribe money stayed worn. It's a case where personal weakness, debt, and a desire to please became institutional corruption, and resignation served as an escape hatch. Fall died broke after millions. In 1929, Albert Fall was released from prison after serving 9 months for accepting bribes in the Teapot Dome scandal. He'd received over $400,000 from oil executives Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, a fortune in 1920s money, in exchange for secret oil lease deals. But by the time he left prison, Fall was broke. Legal fees, fines, and failed investments had consumed his wealth. His New Mexico ranch, once a showpiece, was mortgaged and in disrepair. Fall lived his final years in poverty and obscurity, dying in 1944 in El Paso. The oil leases he'd sold had generated millions for Sinclair and Doheny. The company stayed profitable. Fall, the only cabinet member convicted in the scandal, ended up with nothing. It's one of those ironies where crime didn't pay the criminal, but it paid everyone else involved. The bribe money flowed through his hands and disappeared, leaving only the conviction and the disgrace. Agnew's quiet disbarment. In 1974, shortly after resigning the vice presidency, Spiro Agnew was disbarred by the Maryland Court of Appeals. The disbarment was administrative, almost an afterthought to the resignation and plea deal. Agnew's law license was revoked based on his no-contest plea to tax evasion. But the disbarment documents made no mention of the decades of bribery documented in the plea bargain. Agnew moved on to consulting work, advising foreign governments and businesses, work that didn't require a law license. He wrote a novel, opened an office in Maryland, and stayed connected to political circles. The disbarment was quiet, no hearing, no public shaming, just a bureaucratic procedure. Agnew died in 1996. His obituaries mention the resignation, but treated it as a historical footnote. The consultant career was comfortable. The disbarment was procedural. The bribery stayed in sealed records for years. It's the kind of personal cost that looks significant on paper, but didn't actually limit his life much. A powerful chairman imprisoned briefly. In 1996, Dan Rostenkowski, former chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee and one of the most powerful congressmen of the 1980s, was sentenced to 17 months in prison for mail fraud. The charges related to using congressional funds to purchase personal items, including stamps that he cashed for personal use, and keeping ghost employees on his payroll. Rostenkowski had served in Congress for 36 years and had shaped major tax legislation. His conviction was part of a broader House banking scandal. He served his sentence in a federal prison in Wisconsin. President Clinton pardoned him in 2000, shortly before leaving office. Rostenkowski returned to Chicago, worked as a consultant, and stayed active in local politics. He died in 2010. Colleagues remembered him as an effective legislator who'd made personal mistakes. The prison term was brief. The pardon was full. The chairman fell, served his time, and moved on. The legislation he'd written stayed law. DeLay's conviction overturned. In 2010, Tom DeLay, former House Majority Leader, was convicted in Texas on charges of money laundering related to corporate donations to state legislative races. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The conviction seemed to end DeLay's political career definitively. But in 2013, a Texas appeals court overturned the conviction, ruling that the evidence didn't support the charges. DeLay never served prison time. He'd already resigned from Congress in 2006 under pressure from the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal. The overturned conviction cleared him legally, but didn't restore his political position. DeLay became a lobbyist and political commentator. He appeared on Dancing with the Stars. His career was over not because of the conviction, but because the scandals had made him a liability. The legal vindication came too late to matter politically. The appeals court ruling stayed final. DeLay stayed out of prison. The money laundering charge, real or not, had already served its political purpose. Edwards hung jury and destroyed reputation. In 2012, former Senator and presidential candidate John Edwards stood trial on campaign finance charges related to payments made to conceal his extramarital affair with Rielle Hunter, while his wife Elizabeth was dying of cancer. The charges alleged that nearly $1 million from donors had been illegally used to hide Hunter and their child. The trial was covered extensively, featuring tawdry details about Edwards' private life. The jury acquitted on one count and hung on the others. Prosecutors declined to retry. Edwards was legally vindicated, facing no prison time and no conviction. But his reputation was destroyed utterly. His political career, once promising, he'd been the Democratic vice presidential nominee in 2004, was over. He returned to practicing law in North Carolina. Elizabeth Edwards had died in 2010. His public image shifted from sympathetic widower and progressive champion to cautionary tale about personal hypocrisy. The hung jury meant no conviction, but the trial's public airing of his conduct was punishment enough. The campaign finance questions became secondary to the personal betrayal. Edwards faded from public view. The jury stayed hung. The career stayed dead. Blagojevich's sentence commuted by Trump. In 2011, Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich was convicted on 17 counts, including trying to sell President Obama's vacant Senate seat for personal gain. FBI wiretaps had captured Blagojevich, saying the Senate seat was fucking golden, and he wasn't giving it up for fucking nothing. The recordings were played in court. Blagojevich was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, one of the longest corruption sentences for a governor. He served 8 years before President Trump commuted his sentence in February 2020, calling the sentence ridiculous. Trump's justification was that Blagojevich had already served enough time, and that politicians often engage in the kind of deal-making Blagojevich was convicted for. Blagojevich was released, returned to Chicago, and began appearing on podcasts and local media. The conviction stayed on his record, but he walked free. It's one of those cases where a 14-year sentence became 8 years because a president decided the punishment was excessive. The wiretap stayed public. The Senate seat auction stayed documented. The punishment stayed negotiable. Civil service reform that kept patronage alive. In 1883, after President Garfield's assassination by a disappointed office seeker, Congress passed the Pendleton Act, creating a civil service system based on merit rather than political appointment. The reform was celebrated as the end of the spoils system, where government jobs went to political supporters. But the Pendleton Act only covered about 10% of federal positions initially. Political appointments continued at the cabinet level, in ambassadorships, in judicial positions, and in countless local postmaster and customs positions. The reform system simply renamed patronage as policy-making positions and created a formal civil service layer beneath them. Patronage continued quietly, now divided between career bureaucrats and appointed officials. The system looked cleaner on paper. In practice, presidents still rewarded supporters with positions, just fewer of them and with better titles. The spoils system didn't end, it was refined, formalized, and made slightly more defensible. The Pendleton Act stayed on the books. The appointments stayed political. Senate rules stayed open after Baker. In 1964, Bobby Baker, secretary to the Senate Majority Leader, resigned amid investigations into influence peddling. Baker had used his position to enrich himself through a complicated web of businesses that did work for companies seeking favorable legislation. Senate investigations documented that Baker had built a fortune while on Senate staff, exploiting loopholes in financial disclosure rules and leveraging relationships for personal gain. The scandal led to calls for Senate ethics reforms. Some rules were tightened, financial disclosure requirements increased slightly. But the fundamental system, where Senate staff and members maintain outside business interests, where campaign contributions create access, where lobbying happens in the hallways and over dinners, stayed intact. Baker went to prison for tax evasion and theft. The Senate adopted new rules that mostly required better paperwork. The relationships between money, access, and legislation continued operating under revised procedures. Baker's scandal exposed the system. The system reformed its appearance, but not its function. Ethics committees created, rarely punished. In 1977, after the Koreagate scandal, where South Korean agents bribed congressmen to influence U.S. policy, Congress created standing ethics committees in both chambers. The committees were empowered to investigate misconduct, issue reprimands, and recommend expulsion. The creation of oversight bodies was hailed as a new era of accountability. But the committees are staffed by members' colleagues, funded by congressional budgets, and operate largely in private. Between 1977 and 2020, only a handful of members were expelled or formally censured. Most investigations ended with reprimands, which carry no actual penalty, or with members retiring before investigations concluded. The ethics committees serve a function. They allow Congress to investigate itself and demonstrate seriousness without necessarily producing consequences. The oversight exists. The penalties rarely follow. It's accountability architecture that operates more as pressure release valve than enforcement mechanism. Members police themselves, and the result is predictable. Campaign finance reformed. Super PACs emerged. In 2002, Congress passed the McCain-Feingold Act, banning soft money, unlimited donations to political parties from corporations and unions. The law was supposed to reduce the influence of money in politics. For a few years, it seemed to work. Then in 2010, the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision created space for super PACs, independent expenditure committees that could raise unlimited funds as long as they didn't coordinate directly with candidates. By 2012, super PACs were spending billions. The ban on soft money stayed technically in place, but money simply flowed through different channels. Donors who'd once given to parties now gave to super PACs. Candidates who couldn't ask for seven-figure checks personally could appear at super PAC fundraisers. The reform closed one door and opened another. McCain-Feingold stayed law. Citizens United stayed precedent. The money kept flowing, just through entities with different names and slightly different legal structures. It's the perfect example of reform that worked exactly as designed and accomplished almost nothing. Revolving door slowed, not stopped. In 2007, Congress passed the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, imposing new restrictions on the revolving door between Congress and lobbying. Senators had to wait 2 years before lobbying their former colleagues. House members had to wait 1 year. The restrictions were real, but modest. They slowed the revolving door, but didn't stop it. Former members now wait out the cooling-off period by working as strategic advisors to lobbying firms, positions that involve the same work, but technically aren't lobbying. Or they register as lobbyists, but only contact staff, not members, staying within the letter of the law. Or they simply wait the year or two, then cash in. The lobbying industry adapted. Former members are still highly valued for their relationships and institutional knowledge. The waiting period became an inconvenience, not a barrier. The law stayed in effect. The door kept revolving, just at a slightly slower speed. Wall Street regulated, enforcement gutted. In 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act in response to the financial crisis, creating new regulations for banks, requiring stress tests, and establishing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The law was comprehensive, over 2,300 pages of regulations, oversight mechanisms, and enforcement provisions. For a few years, enforcement was aggressive. Banks paid large fines. The CFPB went after predatory lenders. Then, starting in 2016, enforcement budgets were cut, leadership appointments favored industry, and regulations were rolled back through administrative action. Congress never repealed Dodd-Frank, but agencies weakened it through guidance memos, delayed rule implementation, and reduced examination frequency. By 2020, many of Dodd-Frank's most aggressive provisions existed on paper but were barely enforced. The banks stayed regulated, technically. The regulators stayed funded, barely. It's the kind of reform that survives in statute but dies in execution, where the law stays on the books and the enforcement fades into discretion and resource constraints. Whistleblowers protected, leakers prosecuted. In 2012, President Obama signed an executive order strengthening whistleblower protections for federal employees who reported waste, fraud, or abuse through official channels. The order was presented as ensuring that truth-tellers would be protected from retaliation. At the same time, the Obama administration prosecuted more leakers under the Espionage Act than all previous administrations combined, including cases where federal employees went to the press because internal reporting had failed. The distinction was clear. Report through channels, you're protected. Report to journalists, you're prosecuted. Whistleblowers like Thomas Drake and John Kiriakou faced criminal charges. Official reporting mechanisms often led to investigations of the whistleblower, not the misconduct. The protection existed for those who followed process. The punishment came for those who went public. The executive order stayed in effect. The prosecution stayed aggressive. It's accountability that depends entirely on choosing the right door, and most of those doors lead to nowhere or worse. The files stayed exactly where they'd always been. In the same offices, behind the same locked doors, occasionally transferred to new archives with better climate control. The partnerships quietly continued under revised arrangements that looked different on paper, but worked the same in practice. Senators still took calls from donors whose checks had arrived the week before. Regulatory agencies still hired former industry executives to oversee industries they'd just left. Pardons still arrived for those connected enough to ask the right people. The marble hallways stayed polished. The poker rooms just moved to private clubs with membership fees that served the same filtering function as the old backroom invitations. Some officials faced consequences, prison terms, fines, disgrace. Most didn't. The pattern held across centuries. Power protects itself through procedure, distance, and the careful architecture of deniability. The scandals exposed weren't outliers. They were the moments when the machinery became visible, when someone forgot to lock a drawer, or a journalist followed the money far enough, or a photograph captured what was meant to stay private. What you've heard tonight isn't the exception. It's the operation manual, written by people who understood that democracy's strength, transparency, accountability, public trust could also be its weakness if you knew which levers to pull and which paperwork to file. The system bent, but rarely broke. Reforms arrived and were quietly renegotiated. Oversight bodies were created and learned to look the other way at the right moments. The office stayed occupied. The promises kept being made. And somehow, when morning comes, that feels exactly right.